What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Hello and welcome to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and joining me now in studio is world-renowned psychic Eddie Connor.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, everybody, we have a question for you. Who really murdered Mary Pinchot Meyer in the fall of 1964? Now, that's a question that's still being asked today. Who is Mary Pinchot, you might ask, and how was she connected to JFK? Our guest today will be answering these questions and many more.
Today, author Peter Janney gives detailed information on the American history that has affected us all, and you didn't even know it. His new book, Mary's Mosaic, the CIA Conspiracy to Murder JFK, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and Their Vision for World Peace.
Peter Janney is a graduate of Princeton, where he studied American history under Professor Martin Doberman. Janney earned a doctorate degree in psychology at Boston University in 1981, and he has been a practicing psychologist and consultant for over 30 years. And in 2002, he completed an MBA degree at Duke University.
Peter grew up in Washington, D.C. during the Cold War era of the 1950s and 60s. His father was a senior career CIA official. The Janney family was intimately involved in many of the Washington social and political elite. That included the family of Mary and Court Meyer, as well as other high-ranking CIA officials such as Richard Helms, Jim Angleton, Tracy Barnes, Desmond Fitzgerald, and William Colby.
And please put your hands together and welcome our very esteemed guest, Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie, famed author Peter Janney.
Welcome, Peter.
Great to be with you, Tony. I am looking forward to, giving your listeners this evening something truly worthwhile that they will remember.
Well, I'm excited about this too, and every year it gets closer to the anniversary of the death of John F. Kennedy. We have to have somebody on. Just to kind of keep reminding us that this was a tragedy in American history. But before we get started about the book, I want to kind of get to know you a little bit. Our audience always likes to know a little bit more about the people we have on. So could you tell us a little bit about how you grew up, where you grew up, your family, and that sorts?
Sure. As you mentioned in the introduction, I lived in Washington, D.C. during my formative years. My father came out of World War II as a heroic naval aviator, having won the Navy Cross. Oh. And with a lot of those kinds of people coming out of the war, many were really concerned that there should never be another war, because if one took place, it would be, of course, nuclear. And so people like my father, who were, pretty well off financially, they came from quite wealthy families, who wanted to go to government service, really took an interesting look at this new agency that had been formed in 1947 called the Central Intelligence Agency. And it was here that a number of people like my father decided to take a stand and make a career of working in the CIA under the leadership of Allen Dulles. And that turned out to be a real double-edged sword, which we can get into. So, I was born in 1947. We moved to Washington, I think, at about 1948, when my dad began his work there. And I grew up there with a lot of other CIA brats, as we were called, in various circles. And this was it was fascinating to grow up in Washington, but many of us really didn't know what our fathers were actually doing.
Oh, really?
You know, when we got a little bit older, we all thought our fathers were, you know, various pieces of James Bond. At least that's what we were told. So it really wasn't until I, you know, got into college, you know, in, let's say, the fall of 1966, that the Vietnam War was coming into our foreground, and I became very curious as to what this was all about, what the CIA was actually doing in the world, and particularly what was my father doing as part of it.
Well, I find that fascinating because if you've seen these movies, and I'm going to go back to one that most people are probably like, why are you using that one? It was the one with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Tom Arnold. You know, he was living you know, like a family man, you know, working just at a boring corporate job, but behind the scenes, he was this, you know, secret agent going all over the world, killing people and all this stuff. I mean, was that kind of what? I mean, did he have to kind of hide his
Double life?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, to one degree or another, they all did. They hid their double life from their wives and their family. And I really never came to the true reality of what my father was actually doing until I was heavily involved in writing this book back in 2000, 2007, 2008. And it was during that time where I really learned about who my father was within the CIA and what he was actually doing on a number of fronts, all of which, of course, was never shared with me while I was growing up.
So when you were growing up, what did your dad... I know because I grew up in the Midwest. Eddie grew up in North Carolina. And I just know I was born in 1969, and I know how my family tried to influence my direction in my career. Was there a direction that he was sending you in? Was he trying to maybe get you in the completely opposite direction of what he was doing?
Not really. You know, I mean, we did come to...
Uh-oh.
Relationship with my father really started to disintegrate because, you know, my father was really one of the architects of the Vietnam War, and I made it very clear as I was getting close to graduating from college that I just wasn't going to have any part of it and that I would move to Canada if I had to. And, of course, that really made him apoplectic, you know, given what he had done in his earlier life. And it was really... That I think was probably the main event that, you know, disintegrated our relationship, and it never really recovered because my dad died when he was very young. He never even made it to age 60. A lot of the CIA people, you know, they were hard-charging alcoholics. They didn't take very good care of themselves. So, I mean, my dad died when he was 59 of a heart attack.
That's really young.
Yep.
One term that you, or one word that you said that's kind of reaches out to me is the architect. Now, this is kind of when I hear CIA and Vietnam War,
an architect of the war,
right? Of the war. Tell us a little bit more about that. So, is it something that we didn't know that, or what we've been taught is not right, or was complete? Go ahead.
I love what you're asking. So did you see where mainstream media and news was covering the Vietnam War in a way that was absolutely the opposite of the reality of the war?
Yes, I would completely agree with that. I mean, you know, it took people like Dan Ellsberg, you know, who was, you know, releasing the Pentagon Papers, things that, you know, finally the public got to see what the real truth behind Vietnam was and what we were doing, what we were not doing. You know, targeted assassination programs like Operation Phoenix, which was run by the CIA, is run by Bill Colby, who later became a director of the CIA. I mean, I don't think as a country we really understand what the influence of this organization has had on us. It has completely, in a sense, destroyed the truth of American history. We don't know a lot of our own history because the CIA propaganda efforts have been very, very successful in terms of keeping the public focused on hating Russia, hating Cuba, making anything called communist an arch enemy, not really understanding, for instance, that sometimes the way underdeveloped countries develop themselves is through communism, and when people are ready for a new system of government, they take control.
Right.
Just like in some ways what happened with the American Revolution back in 1776.
So how do you? Well, I'm trying to figure out how the CIA got so big so fast. Was it the powers that be that? I mean, because they have so many departments. FBI. CIA, the drug enforcement. I mean, the list goes on and on. But why did the CIA get so big and so fast?
I will tell you in one word: fear. They were responsible for instilling things like, quote unquote, the Red Menace, or commies are all bad,
right.
or Russia's going to take over the world if we don't stop them here, if we don't stop them there. This was how the CIA really made its mark in terms of grabbing as much power as they could and convincing the public as well as people in the United States government that they needed to be very, very frightened of who and what Russia was, which was completely false. One of the things that the CIA was very successful with in its early days was that it infiltrated the U.S. media and basically ran the media and planted stories in every which way that were conducive to the point of view that they wanted people in our country to take. And it's no contradiction. I mean, in when William Colby was director of the CIA in 1973 to 76, at one point he said, quote, "The CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media," end
Wow.
quote. He actually said that. In the 1980s, when Bill Casey was head of the CIA under the Reagan administration, he said at one meeting, and I quote, "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." That's a direct quote from the director of the CIA. So this is the kind of power that they had because no one dared to confront them or question them because of what they were doing. They really went unexamined by the rest of the parts of our government until Watergate happened. And it was after Watergate that people in the government basically decided to exert a little moral courage, and they called the CIA on the carpet. If you remember post-Watergate hearings, there were a lot of examinations of what the CIA was actually doing. But even then, they emerged scot-free, so to speak, in the sense that they were able to go on doing what they were always doing.
And obviously, it's gotten worse since then, I think. Is that accurate?
It's accurate because, of course, with 9/11, again, the fear level goes way back up. Remember, the Cold War was over.
Yeah.
And it's at those kinds of points, I think, where the CIA starts to get really worried here. We've got to foment some kind of crisis in the national psyche, or we're going to lose our power.
And meanwhile, when you get that kind of fear in the American psyche, the American people lose their power.
They do because they don't know anything different. I think given what's happening today, a lot of people are now rising up in terms of wanting to know what the real truth about certain situations were and are today. And thank God we have the internet, because that is one way where a lot of information gets disseminated and people at least have a fighting chance to read other possibilities of what is taking place other than what you read in the Washington Post or the New York Times, which of course are really
CIA
and surreptitiously engineered by the CIA. I mean, this is all an outgrowth of this early CIA program called Operation Mockingbird, and that was the CIA's effort to infiltrate the U.S. media as quickly as possible and, in a sense, take it over. We have very little today of what is called true investigative journalism. I mean, I could count on my two hands the number of really good investigative journalists alive today who are doing some great work. There are just too few.
Well, and I find that there, even in police departments, and whether it's small town deputies and small town USA, all the way up to the major things, all the way up to like Wells Fargo and the different agencies, the different banking systems, when you do have a handful of integrous people, when you have a handful of honest, sincere people who step forward to complain about unethical things going on, the entire machine turns on them and makes an example of them when they're the ones who are actually trying to alert everybody else as to what's going on.
I would completely agree with that, and you have only to look at what President Obama has done with whistleblowers, really important people during his in office. I mean, he has invoked the National Security Act, to convict whistleblowers more than any president combined. And that has really scared a lot of people from, deciding to reveal the truths that they have come in contact with. And, this is why a lot of us really feel that people like Edward Snowden have done us a great national service in terms of alerting us to what is actually taking place in our country today.
Meanwhile, I just heard this morning, and I don't have the facts. I just heard it. But now the U.S. government, secretly passed legislation that's going to turn our internet
it's already there.
Stuff over into other countries.
Last weekend, it already
did. There you
did.
go. And so it's another way to control.
It won't surprise me. I do think, that there's going to be some real commotion around this, and there's likely to be quite a bit of demonstration about it. But, let's face it, ever since the Kennedy assassination, and this is where, in my book, I say very emphatically, the American experiment in democracy ended on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas.
Yep.
We had a true coup d'etat in America where our president was assassinated by elements within our own government.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Well, Peter, this is leading right into the book, and I know you're a practicing psychologist. And how long did it take from you, having a fallout with your father passing away, and to leading up to writing the book? What happened in between? It sounds like you have a lot of knowledge about the CIA, but you said you didn't know that your dad was even a CIA agent until much later. So what was the in between like for you?
Well, that's a very good question, and here's the story. President Kennedy, for the last 3 years of his life, was involved with this woman, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and he had actually met her at a prep school, high school dance back in 1936. And of course, he couldn't take his eyes off of her at this dance. She was someone else's date at the school dance, but he kept cutting in on her date, a number of times. Now, Mary at that point was 15 years old, and even then, she came from a very progressive, wealthy family, and she had really been taught to identify, to in a sense, self-individuate, become an independent person, really lead a life where she questioned everything, and she was arguably one of the most beautiful women of an entire generation, and she was very, very intelligent and smart. And so she pegged JFK almost immediately as kind of a playboy type who she wasn't really interested in. But they kept in touch through college. He never forgot about her. And, of course, she married another man by the name of Cord Meyer, who everyone thought was destined to be a president someday. I mean, Cord Meyer was a very articulate, highly educated, summa cum laude graduate from Yale University. He had gone into the Marines in World War II, and he had come back, having been wounded, really regretting that he had done what he had done. He was a true pacifist, like Mary, at heart. So when he got out of the Marine Corps, he and Mary came back together, and they got married. But JFK was still around the fringes, and it wasn't until Cord and Mary Meyer got divorced in the late 50s that JFK and Mary started to see one another and consider becoming romantically involved. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that, I knew the Meyer family very well. My mother had gone to college with Mary Meyer. They were in the same class. My father, Peter Janney, and Cord were colleagues at the CIA, and I was best friends with one of the Meyer kids. Unfortunately, he was killed in a car accident when we were 9 years old, and it really created a huge grief for me. It was deeply upsetting to me. And so in order for me to deal with my grief, she really, Michael's mother, Mary, became a very sort of dear friend to me. My two parents were really, they were generally alcoholic. I didn't feel, for whatever reason, that they were very helpful to me at a time like this. But Mary Meyer was, and she really helped me with my own grief as well as her own. So, I stayed in touch with the family off and on. I knew the two other boys as well. But when I came home from prep school in the fall of 1964, the night before Thanksgiving, I hadn't known that in the preceding month that Mary had been murdered on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath in Georgetown. So this was sort of, casually mentioned to me at dinner the night before Thanksgiving, and it really bludgeoned me. I went back to my room after dinner and had a terrible night of just anguish, reliving my earlier grief about having lost Michael, but just also feeling very, very upset and disoriented as to, what had happened. And this event, went deep into my psyche, and I didn't really begin to understand why until several years later in 1976, about 12 years later, we all learned that Mary and JFK had been having an affair, a very serious romantic affair, while he was in the White House. So that's when I started to get really intrigued about, wait a minute, what was going on here?
I bet.
And I started to do my own sort of investigation off and on. And I tried to talk to people, but it really took many, many years before I came to a deeper understanding, largely because, as a training psychologist, you have to spend time in your own personal psychotherapy. It's the best kind of training you can get. Yeah. And this unresolved trauma was still part of my makeup, so it would come up in my own psychotherapy as a patient, and I would, start to deal with it, go deeper with it. So it took actually quite a long time for me to begin to connect some dots. And by and large, there were a number of events that took place that your listeners can appreciate when they decide to read the book. But it was really, much later on when I decided to take on this project of writing the book that had not been written about what really happened, that all of this came out in the wash, so to speak.
Wow. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I am Eddie Connor.
And I'm Tony Sweet.
We have with us here author Peter Janney. He wrote the book Mary's Mosaic. It's the CIA conspiracy to murder John F. Kennedy, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and their vision for world peace, which leads us into... First of all, I could not even imagine having to unravel the layers and layers of emotion and grieving and it would take years. Yeah. It would take literally years. And then I'm sure, as you just articulated to us, that whenever you found out about Mary, it just ripped the scabs back off of your friend from when you were just 9 years old.
Yeah. I mean, there was a considerable amount of, unresolved grief, some trauma around this. But, being involved in terms of becoming a psychologist, this is all grist for the mill. And, luckily for me, I had the assistance of, some brilliant psychotherapists, some brilliant people in the field. And so I had a lot of resources I could take advantage of. I had people I could talk to. And, I also had a real disposition of, God damn it, I want to know the truth. Right. I don't care what it costs me. This is too important. I have got to figure this out. And so this just became part of my life's work.
Well, you can tell that's what drives you, getting to the core essence, the truth of everything, like your observation and your hypothesis with the Vietnam War, for example. And it's hard to stand up to your parents, especially if they have some dysfunction or addiction. That makes it even harder. But for you to be able to do that right out of college, that was a big thing because you felt in your heart of hearts, you knew what your truth was, and that's huge.
Well, I want to ask you this because I've had Laura Eisenhower on our show a couple of times, and I asked her this question. I said, with the information that you're providing to the American people, are you scared that what might happen to you? And she said no, because she says, if something did happen to me, then what I'm saying is true. So
right.
A lot of information you're putting out there, is going against what your father done, against the agency, against the government, and even beyond the government.
Yeah, the machine at large.
Right. So when you putting this together into a book, but there's a lot of information that could be damaging to them, but and especially since your father was involved, were you ever nervous or scared or been approached by anybody that says you need to cease and stop this now?
Well, that's a very good question, and one that we should address. A number of people have asked me, well, did anyone ever threaten your life? And my answer was no, not directly. But during my research years, because my father had worked in the CIA, a lot of former CIA people were willing to talk to me. And one person was a gentleman by the name of Victor Marchetti, who's very well known. He was disaffected from the CIA. He wrote a couple of very great books. And, he was really a fascinating man. He also worked for my father at one point. So I interviewed him twice for my book, and I went to Victor because I knew he could really help me understand certain things. And at the end of our first interview, I said to Victor, Victor, do you think that the CIA is going to threaten me? Do you think they're going to come after me? And he just looked at me and he said, no, they'll just do it.
That's right. Because why would you announce to
Right.
the opposite team
Right.
what your
True.
strategy is to win the Super Bowl when you can just do it?
True.
Right. And it was at that point, right? I mean, I remember the moment very clearly. I realized some of the danger that I was going to have to confront here.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had to make a huge decision at that point. I was engaged to be remarried. I wanted to have a family. And I decided I could not do that and pursue this topic. It would be too risky. It could hurt my potential family, that kind of thing. So I had to, disengage myself from the woman I was engaged to and accept the fact that I really wasn't going to be able to have any children of my own in this lifetime, because if I made this choice to do this book and get to the bottom of really what took place here, it was just too dangerous.
Well, do you also feel that some of that decision is rooted in how traumatized you were when your friend died at an early age?
Well, not really. I think that the real central realization here is that, everyone is always going around in the world shouting what a great country the United States of America is. And there are truly some very great things about our country. But there's also an underbelly of which we have not fully examined. And until we do, we cannot go forward as individuals and as a country until we know the real truth of what has taken place with everything.
Yes.
And this is what is so essential today. And in my opinion, this is one of the real potential positive aspects of what the internet can give us in terms of information. There are a number of people like myself who refuse to just lay down and play dead now, who have taken it upon them. I'm thinking particularly of a lot of very serious JFK assassination researchers that I know. They have dedicated parts of their life to, getting to the real truth about certain dimensions of what took place. But it's not just the Cold War. Right. I mean, look at what we did to the American Indians. Look what we did to the native peoples who occupied this continent way before the Euro-Americans came to this continent. And remember what the Euro-Americans did to those people. Yeah. I mean, they literally butchered them. And so, there are these dimensions of who we are. Of course, we haven't even mentioned slavery, that we have to come to terms with as a country, as individuals, and we have to understand the real truth of what has taken place in our history, much of which the CIA has kept us from knowing.
Exactly. And I think it makes me so mad. Even as a little kid in elementary school and junior high, I remember reading all my little history books. It never felt right. And the fact that we keep brainwashing generation after generation and decade after decade of these young people to believe that it's been a certain way the whole time, it's really hard to undo what you brainwashed 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old people.
And if you think about it, even when movies, television, when it first began, look how they portrayed the Native Americans
as
savages, and is always they butchered the wagons and the people crossing the country.
Well, and one of the things Christopher Columbus wrote in his journal about the Native Americans right after the Thanksgiving celebration, etc., and all of that other stuff, where they were being nothing but gracious and showing them how to hunt and helping them build. He said, "These are the most passive people I've ever met in my life. It's going to be really easy to murder them."
Wow.
Right.
I mean, that shit should be in the history books, period.
Yes.
So
absolutely it should be.
So we literally have about 20 minutes almost
we got
left.
Lots to talk about.
So we really are dying to know who murdered Mary.
Well, the simplest way to say it is that the CIA murdered her.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think we'll ever know who the
exactly.
actual assassin was,
Right.
because those people are highly trained. They come in, they do their work, and they leave, and very few people even know who they are. So I'm nearly 99.99% will never know who the actual assassin was.
Right.
There has been one gentleman who I was able to confirm, who I believe was part of the conspiracy. I talk about him at great length in the new edition of Mary's Mosaic that just came out about several weeks ago. And it's clear after really going into this, into the murder itself, how the CIA orchestrated her demise, and it's very similar to how they orchestrated JFK's demise in Dallas less than a year earlier.
Unbelievable.
Well, okay, you say we know who, but why? I mean, just because she was a mistress of JFK doesn't mean, she would have been killed. So why do you think she was killed?
She was killed because she was going to go public with what she knew. And remember that she was murdered just less than 3 weeks after the Warren Commission report came out. And she bought the paperback version of the Warren Commission when it was first released. She went through it. She had already spent most of the year of 1964 doing her own research about what had taken place in Dallas, and he had a lot of access to people in the JFK world who were able to, tell her that, this was in fact a very pervasive conspiracy. And she put two and two together. And when she read, the paperback version of the Warren report, she was just enraged because she saw what was happening was a second conspiracy, the conspiracy of cover-up. And she knew that the Warren Commission was going to be sold as having solved the crime. She knew it was a complete lie, and she decided that she was going to go public with what she knew and who she was, particularly to JFK, and really stir up a huge storm, which she would have been able to do. This was a woman who was very highly regarded in Washington society. She was the niece of the two-time governor, Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania. Her father was one of the co-founders of the American Civil Liberties Union. This was not someone, who could just be discarded as a floozy and bimbo who didn't know what she was talking about. She was a serious individual. And the last thing the CIA needed at a time like this, with the Warren Commission having just been completed, is anyone like her telling the world something very, very different than what was in that report.
Wow, that's amazing.
Then what was in the report? I mean, the people that haven't read it, let's go back a little over a year when JFK was assassinated. So CIA killed President Kennedy, correct? And if
Correct.
So why?
Well, the CIA knew that they had lost control of President Kennedy. He realized what the CIA and the Pentagon were doing in terms of trying to steer his presidency in a direction that he knew was wrong and he didn't want to go. There would not have been a Vietnam War had JFK been reelected in 1964. He was not going to let that happen. He had already signed National Security Action Memo 263 that basically laid out the plan that 1,000 soldiers were going to come back from Vietnam by the end of the year 1963, and everyone else was going to be out by 1965. He had laid the groundwork already to get out of Southeast Asia. He was also doing a number of other things that were, really upsetting major business leaders. He was, wanting to get rid of the oil depletion allowance. He didn't like what the Federal Reserve was doing. He wanted to take the power away from the Federal Reserve put it back into the Department of Treasury. There were a lot of toes he was stepping on, and they realized that they could not control him anymore. So there was this growing effort to, really start thinking, we've got to get rid of this guy. Of course, the biggest thing is that he was going to end the Cold War. All of your listeners need to realize that in the fall of 1962, we had something called the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. Yep.
And we came as close to obliterating life as we know it on this planet at that moment. Had not JFK and his brother stepped in the way that they did and seek out a negotiated resolution in this conflict, we were on our way to a nuclear war that would have ended life as we knew it. So when that was over, I think JFK really understood how serious a moment this had been, and who also understood this was Nikita Khrushchev. Mm-hmm. This was the moment where the two of them came together as peace brokers and decided that they could never allow something like this to happen again, and that what was really needed is an end to this Cold War mentality. And so they, in a very kind of undercover way, they were writing letters back and forth to one another, and they were setting stage for world peace initiatives. When we come into June of 1963, when JFK is giving his legendary commencement address at American University in Washington, he announces during that speech that he is going to create a limited nuclear arms pact with Russia that very day. And he begins to pursue that immediately. And in less than 2 months, he and Khrushchev agreed to a treaty. The treaty was ratified in September. This was unheard of. And he was doing this behind the backs of the CIA and the Pentagon. He was going to go to the moon. Russia, they were going to do it together. That would have been so symbolic of the Cold War being over, because these two great world superpowers were working together, and they were going to go to the moon together and in a sense, celebrate life on planet Earth. And, look what we can do when we come together as one. So this really infuriated a lot of people within the national security apparatus. In addition, he was already planning to neuter the CIA. He was going to take away their covert action arm so that they would not be allowed to go off and assassinate world leaders, other world leaders, which they had done. They would not be able to uproot other elected democracies in around the planet, which they had done. They had done this already in Iran. They had done it in Central America. People don't realize that the real Darth Vader, the real evil person during that era was Allen Dulles. This was the guy who was trying to lasso Kennedy into becoming his puppet, and just like he had done with Eisenhower. And Kennedy saw who Allen Dulles really was, and he fired him.
Oh, that was probably a mistake, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Allen Dulles had tried to seduce Kennedy into, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and Kennedy wouldn't buy it when it went sour. Allen Dulles wanted him to send in the military to bomb the hell out of Cuba, overthrow Castro, and Kennedy said, no, I'm not going to do it. And so that was a real turning point for what happened in his administration, and it was a huge wake-up call. Now, the other part of this that we haven't mentioned, and we should, was, as I think we all know, President Kennedy had a lot of trouble with women. He had a lot of trouble with intimacy. In today's parlance, we would call him a sexual addict, which he was. And when he was with Mary Meyer, she, pretty much confronted him on this and said, look, if you're not willing to look at yourself and work on yourself, I'm out of here because I don't need you and I don't need this.
Good for her.
You know,
like
if you
her.
want a chance at redemption in terms of really understanding what it's like to be with a real woman, I'll take a chance with you. But either you're going to have to do the work or I'm out of here. And basically, that's what made JFK fall in love with her. He knew he was a troubled man in that arena, and he really came to respect and love Mary Meyer because he realized with her he was in a relationship of redemption where he could finally get at the issues within his own psyche that would really allow him to love a woman in the way that he had never been able to.
When you have that kind of non-resistance in your life, obviously the sexual addiction is a tremendous resistance, but when he had all of that desire in association with Mary, it seems like that's where things tilted to his favor finally, sort of opened up his heart, his mind a little bit more, and gave him like an extra strength he probably would have never had with her. And then when he transitions, she's still like fighting for the truth on behalf of this man that she loved and cared about.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, you know, I think Mary Meyer, we can say, really became, if not his strongest ally, she was right up there with anyone else that he knew. The other thing I think we should just mention, which your audience may find fascinating, is that Mary Meyer was a great believer in the power of hallucinogenic substances, and she was a protege of Timothy Leary's.
Oh,
and
wow.
she went to Timothy Leary in early 1962 and said, look, I have a boyfriend in Washington. He'd really like to be interested in what you're doing. And Leary said, well, why don't you bring him up here and we'll do a session with him. Oh, no, that won't be possible. I mean, she wouldn't even tell him, what his name was. But what Mary knew, or what she believed, is that if she could get together a group of women like herself who would turn on, so to speak, important world leaders in Washington, she believed she could change the world in helping them understand it when they had sort of a more cosmic experience of what life was about. She believed that, this could really be a very important event in terms of creating more of the world peace kind of ethos.
Wow.
Yeah.
So at one point, I maintain in my book, and there's significant evidence that supports this. Mary and JFK did a mild hallucinogenic journey with something called psilocybin before the American University speech. It was several weeks before. And I think this was another useful experience for our president to really open up and see, oh, my God, look what we're doing to the world. This is terrible. We can't do this anymore. And she was instrumental in really helping him to see that the Cold War trajectory was a dead-end street that was eventually going to get us all killed, and that the only way to go was to stand up for a much more planetary, peaceful endeavor of trying to do things in the world that would bring people together in such a way where this continuing conflict of money and wars and military could be resolved, and we could see what the correct goal of life would be.
Well, before we get out of here, I'm going to ask just a couple things. Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, and Lyndon Johnson. Who was part of the plan? All three?
Well, I don't think Lee Harvey Oswald really understood until the very end that he was being used, that he was, in fact, a patsy. It's very clear from all the research that's been done in the last 50 years that Lee Harvey Oswald was an intelligence agency. His so-called defection to Russia in 1959 was completely phony. He was part of a false defector program that was run by the Office of Naval Intelligence under the CIA to train people to go into Russia as sort of disaffected Americans and do what they could to, in their own way of on the Russians.
Right.
It was a terrible program. It didn't work. But Lee Harvey Oswald did go to this installation called the Illusionary Warfare Training Program in Nags Head, Carolina. This is where people were trained to be fake defectors. There's evidence other people saw him there. This guy, William Tosh Plumlee, has signed an affidavit that was there at the same program. He met Oswald there. This guy, Tosh Plumlee, is a very bona fide individual. He's not a kook by any stretch of the imagination. But this was also confirmed to me by the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, Victor Marchetti, who was a CIA officer. And he was very clear about the fact that Oswald was trained there prior to his defection in Russia. So when Oswald comes back, he already has intelligence connections, but he's not aware that he is being set up to take the fall. Now, I'm sure some of your listeners, are having trouble with hearing that or accepting that, but let's remember that, during the House Select Committee on Assassination hearings in 1979, Senator Richard Schweiker was very open and basically said openly, quote, "We don't know what happened in Dallas, but we do know Oswald had intelligence connections. Everywhere you look with him, there are the fingerprints of intelligence," end quote. He actually said that. And this is a sitting U.S. senator who was able to get to take a look at all the documents that no one else has been able to get in the National Archives. And so, it's very clear that this was a huge operation in terms of assassinating a sitting U.S. president.
Wow. And really quickly, Peter, I just want to remind everybody about your book. It's called Mary's Mosaic, and what the Boston Globe says about it, and I quote, "reads like a John Grisham novel crossed with an Oliver Stone movie."
Wow.
And Mr. Oliver Stone says it's a fascinating story. Peter Janney's I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses on. Uninspiring analysis moves us closer to a reckoning. I mean, that is phenomenal. And you've been a tremendous guest. We thank you so much for
I have to
coming and
say,
joining us.
of all of the guests, you're one of my favorites.
Yeah, I know. You're
Really.
right. You're on point. And see, one of the things we love about you, we respond to passion. Truth seekers, truth tellers.
Right.
You're so articulate. You've got like the emotional pulse on the intellectual part of it. You've connected the dots. I cannot think of a better name in all of the universe that you named this than Mary's Mosaic, because you're pulling it all in together and you're making her the core essence center of all of this, and we appreciate you for that.
Well, I think your listeners may be pleased to know that I am now very encouraged. I can't go into any details, but there is going to be a movie made of this story.
I was just thinking that
in the near future.
I was just thinking. I was
Me
like,
too.
this has to be a movie.
I'm covered with goosebumps right now.
Wow.
Oh my
well,
goodness.
I can't wait. I'm going to be the first in line because I want to see it. No,
Well, I think it'll be actually an 8-hour miniseries on
Wow.
HBO or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of material to cover, and of course, I think it will be a very fascinating, exciting story, and it will be also the ultimate history lesson, because I wouldn't even think about signing an option on my book unless I knew that there was someone out there who really understood how important it was to really stick with the real history of what took place, because this is a story that needs no Hollywood embellishment, I assure you.
No, and not only that, and this is a little esoteric, it's my world that I go into when I do this. I literally feel you're being guided by the powers that be in the highest, most spiritual, centered, aligned way. And I'm sure you have JFK and Mary flanking you, bookending you, so that this gets out to the world, which was their intention to start with. So thank you for that.
Tony, you're very prescient.
Well, Peter, thank you so much. Peter Janney. Go to marysmosaic.net and go to Amazon, all the bookstores. I'm sure you can get this book, and we have to say this is one of our favorites. So Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
You got it.
Bye.
We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Oh my God,
I am
Eddie,
reeling right now.
I
covered
have to
with
say,
goosebumps.
Well, I didn't want it to end because there was so much more. But this book, I'm just going to pick it up. It's a big book. Like, you can tell he's put a lot of energy, effort, and
time,
years of research,
and passion, and truth, and authenticity, and sincerity. He's a good friend to this woman, Mary, and her son. So you can just feel it when you hold the book.
I'm gonna ask you, Eddie. Did you not fall in love with Mary?
Oh, I did. Don't we all want a Mary in our life?
Yeah, I mean, somebody that loved, JFK so much, to give him an ultimatum and say, listen, either you, and it wasn't about her, it was about him.
That's right, because she could see and feel his potential. And he was already great. If he got right with himself, he would be 10 times more great.
Oh.
And she knew it. She felt it. She sensed it.
All right, well, we're going to end this hour. We have another hour to coming up. Make sure you tune in for that. It's going to be Michelle Livingston, another very talented, very passionate psychic medium. We hope you guys stick around for that. So don't go anywhere. This is Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
And we're going to be right back in about
4 minutes.
All right. Be right back.